Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over my favorite way to attack the Ponziani opening, and that is with the Ponziani Countergambit. Ponziani starts out with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and then white plays c3, preparing to push forward and control the center of the board. And many players as black don't understand exactly how to defend correctly, and they play too passively. And then they just get overwhelmed because white's able to push forward here with d4, really control the center of the board, and then black has a very cramped position. But the counter gambit says, if you want to try to attack the center of the board, we're going to attack just as much as you are. And so it plays the move f5. Now black's going to give up this pawn and material in exchange for a very strong attack in the center of the board. Now some gambits are very different. Some you give up material and you never really expect to get that back, but you expect to have a very, very strong attack against your opponent. In this gambit, you're eventually going to be able to get that material back. So just keep that in mind as you are playing this, but you do need to understand conceptually what we're trying to do in this counter gambit. Now, there are lots of lines that white can take. In this video today, we are going to be going over the accepted line, which is the pawn takes here on f5. They could decline that. They could just push forward here with d4. They could get their bishop involved into the game. So they have other options. If you guys want to see the decline lines, not taking here on f5, feel free to let me know in the comments below, and I'll definitely make videos on what you want to see. So definitely open to making a video on the decline lines. But in this video, we're going to be going over the accepted lines, which is the pawn takes here on f5. Now from here, black is going to respond with queen to f6. Anytime you give up material, especially in a gambit, you usually want to have a very strong attack, and getting the queen involved in this opening is a key component to that. And the queen supporting this pawn, as well as attacking this pawn here on f5, are going to be very, very important. If you try just immediately to push forward with d5, then it gets troublesome with bishop to b5, because really the threat that they have here is the knight takes here on e5, double attacking this knight. The knight's being pinned, so it gets pretty tricky for black. You know, they could play bishop to d6, defending this pawn right here, maybe d4, and then they push forward. Recognize that not all these moves are forced, but it's difficult to find better options for both sides. So maybe knight to e5, they take right here, take our knight here on c6, check. After we take with our pawn, queen down here to h5, check. There's no way to stop the check. I don't want to just play g6, because then they could just take with the pawn right here. So instead, going to move the king here on f8, and then after the pawn takes here, queen to e8, we could see an exchange, castle on the king side. So both sides are equal in material here, but you can see that white has a very, very strong pawn structure compared to black. It's tough to see how black's actually going to have a productive game. It's really just going to be trying to get a draw out of this. So that's not necessarily what we're looking for. So after the pawn takes, not looking to push forward with a d5 quite yet. Instead, going to be looking to play queen to f6. And there's a few options that you'll see from white here. They could just push forward with d4. That's the main reason that they were playing c3, is to attack the center of the board with protection from the pawn. They could also play bishop to b5, preparing to castle on the king side. This also attacks the knight, which is controlling the center of the board. They also could play some really weird stuff. So we'll go over if they just played, d3, which maybe they decide, hey, we're going to be pushing forward with e4, and so that stops the threat of coming here to e4. So we'll look at the first one, and that is with d4. Now we're just going to push forward. We are attacking the knight right here, and so they have a few options as far as how they can respond. Now, if they play queen to e2, because many times if you push forward with your pawn attacking the knights, they'll usually play queen to e2 at some point in chess. This is not just this opening, but they'll usually play queen to e2. But now black has pawn to d5, and you can see, because we'll look at other variations and how it's going to be different, is this bishop here on f1 is blocked by the queen. So it's not as good to bring the queen to e2 if it's blocking the bishop, because white doesn't really want to castle on the queen side, because the pawn structure is not really built for king safety. And it also is going to take a few moves for white to actually get to a position where it can castle on the queen side. It's going to be very difficult now to castle on the king side because the light square bishop is blocked in. And so this is not really the best option for white, to bring the queen here to e2. So it really comes down to, where is the knight going to move? Okay, well, you have knight to e5. It may look like it's an outpost because the pawn's protecting it, but it's just not going to work out well. The knight takes, pawn takes here, queen takes here on e5. Next move, you could have the pawn push forward here to d5. You could have the queen take here on f5. And you can see that white doesn't have any of their pieces developed. Black has the only central pawn on the board. This is going to be completely fine for black. So definitely not the best option for white. Could also play knight to d2. In this case, I would go ahead and take with the queen here on f5. I think it gets a little bit dangerous if you don't, because this square here on h5 is actually a real threat that white has. So if you play pawn to d5, just saying that we'll go ahead and open this up. I can take this pawn here with my bishop on f5. Then they can play queen down here to h5. And then you're really going to be playing queen comes back here to f7, and then the queen takes, the king recaptures. It's just not as good of an opening as you would like. So instead, you really want to be taking this pawn here to stop this queen to h5. So instead of d5, we're going to just be playing queen takes here on f5. Now, it is somewhat odd also for them to bring their knight back here to d2. Just want to make sure that you are prepared if they do that, because this is blocking off both the knight coming here to d2, which it's already blocked off on c3. It's also blocking off the dark square bishop here. So the other option that you could see is knight to g5. This is protected by the bishop here on c1, and it also attacks this pawn here on e4. And this is the best option for white. And so black's going to play d5. This supports the pawn here on e4. Black has both central pawns. Also opens up for the light square bishop to attack this pawn here on f5. And white has a few options from here. The best lines would be either to get their queen here to h5, which then we can just block with g6. And even if they take, we can recapture with our pawn. And usually you don't want to do this because your rook is hanging, but our queen is actually protecting the h8 square. So they can't take that. They're going to be forced to move their queen back. And then we can just play bishop to f5, getting ready to castle on the queen side, get our rook activated. We have all of our pieces opened up here. So this is definitely one option if you see the queen come involved into the game to h5. They could also just play g4, trying to add another defender on this f5 square. But you can also see this weakens the king side for castling for white. Either way, black's going to be able to castle to the queen side and put a lot of pressure on white's king, because where does white really castle from here? So their king's usually going to be in the center of the board for a while. But now we can just push forward with h5. And if they take here, that's fine, because that was the defender on this f5 square. We can take with our bishop here. Maybe bishop comes down to b5. Just trying to activate. We could play knight to e7 if we want to, but we can look to castle on the queen side. They may not even get their bishop involved into the game. Just showing you a few options of what you could see. Now, after the move queen to f6 from the beginning, they may not push forward with d4 because they see our pawn right here, and they may not just want to worry about the pawn pushing forward to e4. So they may play bishop to b5. Get the bishop outside so that the queen at some point can come to e2, which makes a lot of sense. Also preparing to castle on the king side. Many players, if they face a gambit or a counter gambit, they usually like to have king safety, and so bishop to b5 allows for that. Now there's a few options of what you could see from here, but first we're going to start with e4. And this puts pressure on the knight. Now, they could play queen to e2, and you can see how different this is than when the bishop was here on f1, because now we can't take with our pawn. It's pinned down by the queen to the king here. but it's not necessarily as bad for whites because they can still castle on the king side. But they may not play the queen to e2 quite yet. We'll look at that option as well. But they could just play knight to d4. This is an outpost. It's defended by the pawn here on c3. If that's the case, though, we're just going to take with our knight. If they take with their pawn, we push forward with c6, almost a Ponziani on our own with c6, and then pushing forward at d5 at some point. So maybe bishop e2, and then pawn to d5, opening up for light square bishop to take here on f5, capture or castle on the queen side. So that's going to be pretty good for us. Now, if they don't play the knight, maybe they just say, we'll just take with our bishop, then we can recapture with our pawn, and maybe now they play queen to e2, and we can block the pin with bishop to e7. This is a common line that you may see, and you can start to see the power of the counter gambit as you get all of your pieces involved into the game. But now they may decide, okay, we'll go ahead and take that pawn here on e4. But now we could play bishop takes on f5, attacking the queen. The queen comes back to e3. Now we castle on the queen side. It's all about getting all your material involved into the action. So they may castle on the king side, and then we play rook to d3. And the reason I like this, because you have a couple options. You could play bishop to d3. This bishop's protected by the rook here. This is attacking the rook. The reason I like rook to d3 is because if they look at this and say, well, shoot, my queen is under attack here. I need to move my queen. Where can I go? Can I gobble up material? I'll just go ahead and gobble up material here on a7. That's a pretty easy play for them to make, but that's going to be a huge mistake. Where if you just play your bishop here to d3, they can just play rook to e1, and then you're not really threatening the queen right here. And so it's more difficult, I think, for them to make a huge mistake. But it's pretty logical to play rook to d3, and then queen to a7 and not recognize the massive threat that you have, but the threat is the rook takes here on f3. If they take the rook on f3, it's game over. It's a forced mate. They can't stop it because you have bishop to h3, and then we're going to be threatening queen to f3, and then queen to g2, and there's no way to stop that. We really just baited them to bring their queen here to a7. The queen is never able to get back and stop what black is trying to do here. You can see that the pawn here on c6 is keeping it so that the queen here is never able to attack or defend this square here on f3. And they could make an attempt, maybe queen to a8 check, and then king d7, and then queen up here to a4. But after queen takes on f3, there's no way to stop the mate. So if we come back, we can see that the pawn can't take the rook here. So how do they really respond? Okay, well, they could play g3, but then we could play bishop to h3, then maybe rook to e1, but then black has an even better move, and that is the rook takes on c3. And they still can't take it. Let's say knight takes on c3. Well, now we have queen to f3, preparing to mate here on g2, and they still have all the ways that they can try to prolong this game. That's fine, but at the end of the day, it's going to be checkmate. So they can't stop that as well. So this rook here on d3, that's why early on I say go ahead and play that rook to d3. It's so dangerous because it gives them an opportunity to make a mistake, and that's what I'm always trying to do, put my opponent in a position where they can make a mistake. I don't want them to look at this and say, okay, well, I haven't been in this position before, but if they're attacking my rook, I'll move my rook, and I'm going to move it to e1. That makes a lot of sense. But if you play this, if they know they have to move their queen, it makes a lot of sense to play queen to a7. So that's some different ways that you could play early on. If they take with their bishop here on c6, now they may not. Instead of taking with the bishop here on c6, they could also just play queen to e2. Now, in this case, I recommend playing queen to e7, to block this off, not playing the bishop to e7. Now, because the pawn's no longer pinned, we can take their knight, so they probably need to move their knights. And so if they play knight to d4, we can just take with our knights. If they take, we can still play the same thing, c6. Now they have a couple options. They don't have to just move their bishop right away. They could play the queen to a5, check. Now we're just going to bring our queen over here. If they take, that's fine. Now they move their bishop back. We play pawn to d5, opening up for our bishop to get involved into the action. Our king's not as bad here on f7 because the queens are off the board here. And even if they come to maybe g4, they take here. We take with their bishop, and it's going to be difficult for them to hold on to this pawn the rest of the game. Double pawns on the outside, the h or the a file, are the hardest to hold on to. And so eventually black's going to be able to get that material back. If they don't play the queen to h5, because it does look like an odd move sometimes, they could just bring their bishop back. So they could play bishop to a4 if they wanted to. And then you could just play d5, preparing for bishop takes here on f5. Those definitely are the main things that you'll see. You also could see some weird stuff. If you play queen to f6, they could play d3. Just go ahead and take the material here on f5. Don't try to get cute with anything else. It's tough to even figure out how they're going to continue here. Maybe bishop to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. The bishop can't go anywhere else, and they may be confused and trying to play somewhat passive. So this could make some sense, but just start to take over. Play d5. You already got your material back. Now you can control the center of the board. Maybe castle on the king side. You play knight to f6 here. That seems fine. Maybe they recognize their mistake and now play d4. But now you could play e4, and it's even better before, because now if they play bishop to e2, you could play bishop to e7. You've already taken that pawn back, so this is going to be very fine. It's difficult to see how they're really going to continue here. If they play knight to g5, we play knight to f6 here. Then we can start to push forward with h6. Very difficult to see how white comes out of this. You can see they can't play their light square bishop. It's blocked off. Black can castle on the king side. Can also, at some point, play d5. Light square bishop involved, castle on the queen side. So I feel like black has a lot more options than white. If they don't play queen to e2, they could also try knight to h4. But then we just bring our queen back here to f7. This is a fine square for the queen to be at. You could still play bishop to e7 after this. And that's a real threat. I mean, bishop to e7, where does the white knight go to? It doesn't have any good squares. And so this is, a pretty good square for the bishop. So that's going to be the next move that I would play for black. So that is the Ponziani Countergambit, my favorite way to attack if your opponent ever tries that sneaky c3 where they think, I'm going to catch my opponent off guard. They're not going to know what to do because I'm going to control the center of the board. You can just strike back with the third move of f5. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, if you wouldn't mind hitting that like button. Also, if you want to see the decline lines, because they don't have to take here, I will make another video on the decline lines. There's about 2 or 3 lines that I think would be beneficial to know. So if you want to see that, feel free to let me know. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.